This little boy here, this is Isaac Edward Schondelmeyer. He was born a few days early. In fact, it was early in the morning on November 29th, the first Sunday of Advent. My wife Abby had been having pain most of the day on that Saturday, and eventually her doctor told her she needed to head up to the hospital. In the midst of this pandemic, things are all mixed up, and visitors are not allowed at the hospital. And that's the same rule for women in labor too. When we first got to the hospital, they told us that Abby would be allowed to go up to the labor and delivery unit to get checked out, and if she was truly in labor and they were going to admit her, then and only then would I be allowed to come into the hospital. Until then, I had to wait in the car. And COVID-19 has made things so difficult for so many. And as I waited in the car, so many different emotions washed over me. They flooded through me. At first, I was so upset. That was my wife. That was my baby. I needed to be with them. But then my feelings changed. I began to feel a little selfish. I felt guilty that I was so upset with these rules, as if my situation was so much more important than others. I thought about my colleagues whose loved ones have died from the virus, and they were not even allowed to be there with them when they took their last breath. Everyone is feeling the weight of this pandemic, and so for me to be so upset, what was the point in feeling that way? The hospital's just doing their best to keep people safe. And then I began to feel useless. My emotions changed again, and I began to feel useless. Abby was inside suffering contractions all on her own, and I was outside in the car doing nothing. In fact, throughout her entire pregnancy, there wasn't much that I had done to help get us to this point. She's the one who carried this precious baby boy for 9 long months. I have no idea what that's like. Finally, I got the phone call. Got the phone call from Abby telling me that I had been given permission to come inside. They were going to admit her. She was indeed in active labor, and they were prepping the operating room for a C-section because our 2 other kids had been born through C-sections, and so it had already been deemed that was the safest way for us to proceed with this delivery as well. And so I grabbed all our stuff from the car and I headed back to the entrance. But this time I felt empowered. I walked with my head held high because I had been given permission to come on into the inside. I finally made it to Abby's room with all of our stuff, and she was in a triage room in the labor and delivery floor, waiting for an operating room and the doctors to get ready. She was having contractions. I did my best to be supportive, but again, I just felt like there wasn't much that I could do at this point. And then they came in and said it was time. And so I put on all the medical PPE that they had provided so that I could be in the operating room during the delivery, and I was ready to go. And then the nurse said, "Oh, not you. Right now we can just take Abby. We have to get her ready for surgery and give her an epidural." Now, it might be because it was so late, or rather it was actually so early in the morning at this point, but I was feeling like I wasn't quite sure what my purpose was at this point. I mean, what was I doing there? When our son Alexander was born in Toledo, I was there through almost every moment. I mean, I took her on the inside. I helped her get comfortable. When they gave her an epidural, I was there holding her hand. But this time, all the things that the dad is supposed to do, I was being prevented from doing. That feeling of being useless just sank even deeper into my gut. I felt like I was the third wheel in a poorly cast Hallmark movie. I felt like an afterthought, someone who was just in the way for this thing, this miracle that was only Abby's to experience. Eventually, they did allow me to come into the operating room, and she was covered in blankets and hooked up to monitors, and an IV was running. They said, "Here, Dad, this chair is for you. You can only sit here." I mean, my place was determined before I ever got to that room. You know, I wonder if this is anywhere near how Joseph felt. I wonder if during the 9 months of Mary's pregnancy, if he ever felt useless. I wonder if he too wrestled with feeling like he was an afterthought in this miracle that was Mary's to deliver. I wonder if he ever felt like he was the third wheel in this love story between Mary and God. I wonder if he ever wrestled with his place, with what his place was truly supposed to be. What was his role in this birth narrative? Now, eventually the nurse said to us as they were operating on Abby, they said, "Okay, it's time for your baby to be born. Do you want to see?" I said, "Yes, of course I want to see." And so she pulled down this blue barrier and revealed a clear plastic barrier so that we could see what the doctor was doing. And I couldn't really see the doctor's hands at first, but then her hands emerged. And it felt like we were in the movie The Lion King, when the new baby lion Simba was held high in the air after his birth to show that he would be the one that would one day become the next king. The doctors held Isaac up and said, "Meet your new baby boy." And at that moment, everything changed. Because Abby was incapacitated, laying on the operating table, unable to move, I would need to hold Isaac. The nurses were covered in PPE, including gloved hands. The first real human contact that this precious baby boy would feel would be from me, from this guy who felt so useless up to this point, from me, this guy who had been chosen by God to be this precious baby boy's earthly dad. The first human contact he would feel would be from me. And after we briefly introduced Isaac to Abby, Isaac and I were led back to the room we had been in before the delivery, and I took off my shirt and I embraced his tiny, vulnerable body, and I just held him skin to skin, close to my body. This was my role. This had been my role the entire time. I just hadn't realized it in the moment. My role wasn't in the 9 months of pregnancy. I tried to be supportive. My role wasn't in the delivery itself. I was there for every moment they would allow me to be, but my role came afterwards, after the birth. Violent extremism, politicized census process, political chaos, fear of refugees, disease rampant and spreading due to poor communal hygiene and poor public health practices, economic exploitation of those who are most vulnerable, hypocrisy from the highest levels, even from religious leaders in the face of such evil political realities. No, my friends, I'm not talking about the world we live in today, though there are many similarities. No, this was the world that Jesus was born into. This was the world that he met at his birth, a world that made his life even more vulnerable than it already was. It was this context that defined the role that Joseph was called to play for Mary's precious baby boy. His role was not in the 9 months of pregnancy or in the delivery itself. His role, like mine, came after the birth. I mean, I think there's probably no doubt that Joseph questioned what his role was before Jesus was born. How could he not? How could he not when his fiancée tells him that she is pregnant before they were even married? He knew that God's call before the birth was for Mary. But the scriptures, especially the Gospel of Matthew, make it extremely clear that God's call after the birth was for Joseph. God showed up in his dreams to warn him and to call him to this important role of being a dad. God needed Joseph to help usher Jesus safely into this chaotic and upside down world. God needed Joseph to care for Mary and for Jesus, to provide for them. God needed Joseph to protect them when they were vulnerable and all on their own. In the midst of this crazy and upside down world that we are living in today, I think that Joseph might just be our metaphor this Christmas. This has been a chaotic Advent season. This has been a chaotic year as we've been physically distanced from one another, quarantined in our homes. Many have wanted to help fellow neighbors in some way, but it's hard sometimes to know how. It's been tough for so many to know what their role is during this difficult, vulnerable time. It often seems like there isn't much we can do. I mean, most of us can't create a vaccine. Most of us aren't doctors or nurses, but I'll tell you, we give so much praise for those of you who are. We're not politicians, and we have no power to help provide economic relief for those who are struggling. We're just regular people. I mean, we want to help, but we don't know how. And like I was, out waiting outside in the car for Isaac's birth. But sometimes we're actually told that we can't be there to help. But friends, Christmas reminds us that the birth happened. Even when the world was so upside down, the birth happened. Even in a chaotic political environment, the birth happened. As I sat there waiting for Abby to come out of surgery, just holding Isaac's body close to mine, it all became clear to me. God needs me, just like God needed Joseph to usher this precious baby boy into this chaotic world. It was Joseph's job to get Jesus safely through that chaotic time. And because Jesus' life had been threatened by the corrupt political forces, Joseph fled with Jesus into hiding, away from the public. In fact, they fled to another nation until it was safe to emerge again. And as the Church of Jesus Christ, in the midst of this deadly global pandemic, friends, that's our role. Christmas reminds us that God gave birth to hope through Mary. Jesus has come. Our role is to be like Joseph, to help keep hope alive through this pandemic until it is safe to come out on the other side. I mean, friends, Jesus is our hope. I mean, He is the hope of the world. And your role in the name of God is to hold on to hope so tightly. Your role is to hold on to hope so tightly during this pandemic until it is safe to come out on the other side. Don't grow weary. Don't give up. Don't give up and let your hope be vulnerable to the political forces of the world around us. Viruses like this don't care about political affiliation. This isn't a partisan plea. You hold on to hope. And don't let go. This is our call this Christmas, to help hope stay alive like Joseph helped Jesus. I mean, friends, we will get through this difficult time. I mean, we know how the story goes. God has already shown us Jesus is born. Hope is alive. And God needs us to help keep it alive so that the next generation can look at our example. So that the next generation can look at our example and see our sacrifices for each other in the name of God. This Christmas, my friends, may you experience the hope of Christ witnessed in the birth of a precious and vulnerable baby boy. And may you know that each and every one of you has a very important role to play like Joseph. You have a role to play after the birth. You have a role to play after the birth in helping to keep hope alive. until it is safe to come out on the other side. Amen.